Big Shaq walked in as a legend and left as a target. Accused of using fake money, the cops thought they had him. But minutes later, they were the ones suspended. What happened next wasn't just justice, it was a game-changing reckoning. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The city knew him by many names. Big Shaq, the Giant, the Walking Mountain. But what they didn't know was who he really was. On the surface, Shaquille O'Neal was the smiling millionaire, the man who could walk into a store and pay off a stranger's debt without blinking. He was the guy who handed out $100 bills like they were candy, tipping waitresses more than they made in a month just because he felt like it. He bought houses for single mothers, cars for struggling dads, and school supplies for kids who had nothing but dreams. To the public, he was a saint. To his closest friends, he was a king who never wanted a throne. But what people failed to realize was that Big Shaq wasn't just kind. He was calculating. He didn't do things without reason. He moved in silence, making power plays while the rest of the world was too busy looking at his size, his money, his smile. They never looked at his mind. And that's why they lost before the game even started. Shaq had learned early that the loudest man in the room was usually the weakest. He didn't need to flex his wealth or remind people of his influence. He just was. And that was more than enough. The world thought they had Shaq figured out. That was their first mistake. It was just another day in downtown Los Angeles. The air was thick with the scent of street food, the distant hum of traffic filling the sidewalks with noise. Shaq walked like he always did, unbothered, undetected, unshaken. People noticed him, of course, how could they not? He was a 7-foot giant, his presence commanding attention even when he didn't want it. But he had a way of blending in despite standing out. Dressed in a simple black hoodie and sweatpants, he was just another guy taking a stroll. The world knew he was rich, but he never flaunted it. That was another thing people never understood. He wasn't in love with money. He had it, but it never had him. Shaq stopped at a local diner, one he'd been to a few times before. It wasn't fancy, wasn't a 5-star joint with overpriced steak and pretentious service. It was real, and that's what mattered. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside, the warm aroma of coffee and griddled pancakes wrapping around him. The place was quiet, a few customers scattered in booths, lost in their own worlds. Shaq took a seat at the counter, nodding at the older woman behind it. She was in her late 50s, silver strands of hair tucked into a bun. Exhaustion settled into the lines on her face. She smiled, recognizing him immediately. "Back again, huh?" she asked, wiping her hands on a rag. Shaq chuckled. "You know me. Can't resist a good breakfast." She laughed, shaking her head. "Big guy like you? Bet you need to eat 10 of them." He smirked. "Something like that." She poured him a cup of coffee without asking. She remembered his order. That was rare these days. Shaq noticed the tired way she moved, the weight on her shoulders that had nothing to do with age. He'd seen that look before, too many times. "How's business?" he asked casually. She hesitated, forced a smile. "Could be better. But hey, we're still standing, right?" Shaq didn't respond right away. He just sipped his coffee, watching her. He saw through people. And right now, he saw a woman who was drowning. By the time he finished his meal, the place had gotten a little busier. A group of cops sat in the corner, chatting loudly, their laughter cutting through the hum of the diner. Shaq barely paid them any mind. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a few crisp $100 bills, placing them under his empty plate. Then, after a moment's thought, he pulled out more. A total of $5,000 sat on the table. A tip. No announcement. No cameras. Just a silent gesture. The waitress returned, blinking at the cash like it was an illusion. Her breath hitched. "Shaq, I can't." "You can." He stood, giving her a simple nod. "And you will." She covered her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't even know what to say." He patted her shoulder. "Then don't say anything." And with that, he turned and walked out. The cops in the corner had been watching. One of them, Detective Russell Haynes, smirked as he leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against his badge. That's a lot of money, he muttered, eyes trailing after Shaq. His partner raised an eyebrow. So? Haynes tilted his head. So, you ever notice how easy it is for guys like him to throw cash around? His partner shrugged. Man's a millionaire. Yeah, Haynes said, a slow smirk curling on his lips. But where's it coming from? He reached over, plucking one of the bills off the table before the waitress could grab it. The other officers chuckled. What are you doing? Haynes held the bill up to the light, rolling it between his fingers. Just checking something, he murmured. His eyes gleamed with something too sharp, too dangerous. And that was the moment the game began. Shaq didn't think twice about the tip. He wasn't looking for gratitude. He wasn't trying to prove anything. That wasn't his style. But the city had a way of twisting things. By the next morning, his world would shift. By the next morning, everything would change. Because sometimes kindness isn't met with gratitude. Sometimes, it's met with suspicion. The night air carried a quiet chill as Shaq walked down a dimly lit street, his breath misting slightly in the glow of flickering neon signs. It was late, but the city never truly slept. The hum of distant traffic, the occasional shout from a late-night bar, the soft murmurs of people passing by, it all blended into a familiar rhythm. Shaq wasn't in the mood for fancy restaurants or high-end spots tonight. He preferred places like this, small, forgotten corners of the city where real people lived real lives. The ones who weren't flashing designer suits or driving six-figure cars. The ones who worked hard, struggled harder, and kept going anyway. He spotted the diner up ahead, its peeling paint and flickering sign giving it the kind of charm only time could create. It wasn't his first time here. The food wasn't anything special. But the people, they were real. And Shaq had always valued real. He pulled open the glass door, the little bell above it jingling as he stepped inside. The smell of grilled bacon and stale coffee greeted him, mixing with the faint scent of cleaning supplies. A handful of customers were scattered in booths, lost in their own worlds. Behind the counter, a woman in her early 40s wiped down a coffee pot. Exhaustion settled deep into her features. Her uniform was slightly wrinkled, her hands rough from years of labor. Shaq recognized her immediately. She'd been working here for a while. He didn't know her name, but he knew her story. A single mother, raising 2 kids on her own, juggling 2 jobs just to stay afloat. She looked up and spotted him, her tired eyes widening slightly before softening into a weary smile. Well, well, she said, setting the pot down. Didn't think I'd see you back here. Shaq chuckled, settling onto a stool at the counter. You know me, can't resist a good meal. She shook her head, smirking. Big guy like you? Bet you eat enough for 3. He laughed, a deep rumbling sound that made a few nearby customers glance over. He didn't mind. People always stared. It came with the territory. She poured him a cup of coffee, black, just how he liked it. Same order. He nodded, watching as she moved to the grill, calling out his order to the cook in the back. She worked with the kind of speed and efficiency that came from years of doing the same thing over and over. Muscle memory. Survival. As he sipped his coffee, he noticed the weight on her shoulders, the way her movements seemed just a little slower than the last time he was here. Life had a way of wearing people down, grinding them to dust until all that was left was routine and obligation. Shaq had seen it too many times. His meal came, simple but satisfying. He ate in comfortable silence, watching the world move around him. A few customers left, a few new ones came in. In the corner, a group of cops sat at a booth, their laughter carrying across the small diner. Shaq barely paid them any mind. He wasn't the type to feel uneasy around police, not because he was naive, but because he had always moved carefully. Still, there was a certain energy in the room now. One of the cops, a man with a square jaw and piercing eyes, kept stealing glances at him. Shaq ignored it. He was used to being watched. When he finished eating, he pulled out his wallet, peeling off a few crisp $100 bills. Then, after a moment's thought, he pulled out more. A total of $5,000 sat on the counter. A tip, no announcement, no cameras, just a silent gesture of kindness. The waitress turned, saw the cash, and froze. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for it. her breath catching in her throat. "Shaq, I can't." "You can," he said simply. "And you will." Tears welled in her eyes. Real, unfiltered emotion. "I don't even know what to say." "Then don't," he said with a soft smile. She stared at the bills as if afraid they might disappear, her fingers brushing over them like they were something sacred. Shaq stood, adjusting his hoodie, and started toward the door. And that's when he heard it. "That's a lot of money." The voice was low, edged with something too sharp, too cold. Shaq didn't have to turn around to know who it belonged to. Detective Russell Haynes. Shaq had seen guys like him before. He wasn't overtly racist, not the type to spit, slurs in your face. No, his kind was worse. The kind that hid behind a badge, using protocol as a weapon. The kind that would smile at you in public but pull the trigger in private if they thought they could get away with it. Shaq paused but didn't turn. Haynes leaned back in his seat, arms draped lazily over the booth, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. He was studying Shaq, sizing him up like a predator assessing its prey. "You must be feeling real generous tonight, huh?" Haynes mused, his voice dripping with mock amusement. "Or maybe you just got cash to burn." Shaq still didn't respond. He'd learned a long time ago that silence was power. Haynes exhaled through his nose, then casually plucked one of the bills off the counter before the waitress could grab it. The room tensed. The waitress looked panicked, her gaze darting between Shaq and the cop. The other officers at the table chuckled, but it wasn't friendly. It was the kind of laughter that carried bad intentions. Haynes held the bill up to the light, rolling it between his fingers. "Funny thing about money," he said. "Some of it's real, some of it ain't." The smirk deepened. He was baiting Shaq. Shaq finally turned his head, locking eyes with the man. His expression remained calm, unreadable. "Something you want to say, officer?" Haynes tapped the bill against the table. "Just making an observation, big man. You ever check where all your money comes from?" The question hung in the air, thick with unspoken accusations. Shaq held his ground, his face betraying nothing. "You let me know if you find something interesting." And with that, he walked out. The night was colder now, but Shaq barely felt it. He exhaled slowly, his breath fogging up in the air. He didn't need to look back to know that this wasn't over. Because men like Haynes, they never let things go. And Shaq had just become a target. But today, that feeling wouldn't last. As he rolled through the intersection, he noticed them. A police cruiser in the rearview mirror. At first, he didn't think much of it. Shaq had been in the public eye for decades. Cops followed him sometimes just to catch a glimpse. But then another squad car appeared from the side street. And another. His fingers tightened on the wheel. Then came the flash of red and blue lights, the piercing wail of a siren. Shaq exhaled slowly, pulling over to the curb. He didn't panic. He didn't even feel nervous. He'd been around cops his whole life. Some good, some bad, some just waiting for an opportunity to prove that power was more than money. He cut the engine and reached for his ID, keeping his movements slow, calculated. A man his size had to be careful. A voice crackled through a megaphone. "Step out of the vehicle with your hands where we can see them." Shaq's brow furrowed. That was not standard procedure. Still, he did as he was told, pushing open the door and stepping onto the pavement. The morning air was crisp, biting against his skin. Then came the hands, rough, forceful, unnecessary. They grabbed his arms, shoving him against the car before he could even ask what was happening. "What's the problem, officer?" His voice was steady, controlled. A pair of handcuffs clicked around his wrists. Shaq stilled. It had been a long time since he'd been in cuffs. Not since he was a kid. Not since before the fame, before the money, before the world decided he was worth something. But here he was. A 7-foot multimillionaire, treated like a common criminal. Detective Russell Haynes stepped into view, his smirk sharp as a blade. "Morning, big man," he said, mock politeness dripping from every word. "Nice car. That run on counterfeit bills too?" Shaq didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He just stared, his expression unreadable. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, voice calm. Haynes clicked his tongue, shaking his head. See, that's funny, because we got a report saying some fake money was being passed around last night. And guess whose bills just happened to be in the mix? Shaq could feel the tension thickening around him. Pedestrians had stopped to watch. Phones were already out, cameras rolling. The media would have a field day with this. He inhaled through his nose, exhaled slowly. They wanted him to snap. They wanted him to get angry, to yell, to give them a reason to escalate. He wouldn't give them that. Instead, he met Haynes's gaze with the kind of quiet authority that made lesser men uncomfortable. "You just made the biggest mistake of your career," Shaq said, his voice low, even, lethal. Haynes's smirk faltered just a fraction, and that was enough. The ride to the station was humiliating in ways Shaq couldn't describe. Cuffed in the back of the squad car, he could feel the weight of the world pressing against him. He could hear the whispers, the murmurs, the ugly satisfaction in the voices of the officers in the front seat. "Thought money made you untouchable, huh?" One of them sneered. Shaq didn't respond. He'd learned a long time ago that silence was its own weapon. But inside? Inside, something burned. Not just anger, not just frustration. It was something deeper, something sharper. He had spent years building a reputation, making sure that no matter what happened, he would never be seen as just another statistic. And now, he was another black man in cuffs, another face in the system. The moment they pulled into the station, the media was already there. Reporters swarmed like vultures, cameras flashing, microphones shoved forward as they shouted questions. "Shaq, do you have any comment? Is it true you were caught using fake money? Do you think this will affect your endorsements?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was enough. The officers paraded him through the front doors, past desks of stunned officers who couldn't believe what they were seeing. Big Shaq. In cuffs. It was a headline they never expected. A moment the world wouldn't forget. The interrogation room was cold, sterile, suffocating. Shaq sat across from Haynes, his wrists still cuffed to the metal table. The detective leaned forward, fingers steepled, his expression one of mock concern. "Listen, man." Haynes sighed. "You're a public figure. A role model. This doesn't have to get messy." Shaq tilted his head slightly. "Messy?" Haynes nodded, feigning sympathy. "Yeah. You got a lot to lose, big man. You cooperate, tell us where the money came from, and maybe, just maybe, we can work something out." Shaq let a slow smirk curl at the corner of his mouth, the first real reaction he'd given. And for the first time, Haynes looked uncertain. Shaq leaned forward slightly, his massive frame eclipsing the detective's presence entirely. "I got one question for you, detective," he said, voice low and unshaken. Haynes shifted in his seat. "Yeah?" Shaq's smirk faded. "You sure you want to play this game?" The air between them shifted. Haynes had power here, or at least he thought he did. But something in Shaq's tone, the absolute certainty in his voice, made it clear. He was the one holding the real cards, and Haynes knew it. An hour later, the door swung open. Shaq's lawyer walked in, looking furious and lethal in a tailored suit. The conversation was short. The charges were vague. And then, just like that, Shaq was free. No apology, no explanation, just a quiet, awkward dismissal. He walked out of the station, cameras still flashing, the world still watching. But something had changed. This wasn't over. This wasn't just about fake money. It was about something bigger. And Shaq? Shaq was about to find out exactly how deep the corruption ran. It started with a single video, a shaky, low-quality clip taken from across the street. The kind that starts mid-sentence, missing context, missing reason. But it didn't need context. The image was enough. Big Shaq, handcuffed, pushed against his own car, surrounded by cops. Within minutes, the video hit Twitter. By the time Shaq was released from custody, it had already racked up over 2 million views. And then it spread like wildfire. The tweets came fast, brutal, and divided. Real Talk News. Breaking. Shaquille O'Neal arrested for allegedly using counterfeit money. This is huge. Shaq, fan 22. Nah, no way. Shaq got more money than half these cops combined. He don't need to use fake cash. Blue badge truth. If he wasn't guilty, he wouldn't have been arrested. Stop making excuses for criminals. A justice for all. A black man gets arrested for spending money, and y'all don't see the problem? Within an hour, it was on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok. Clips replayed on news channels, headlines flashing across every screen. CNN. Shaquille O'Neal detained, investigation underway. Fox News. Counterfeit cash. Did Shaq know? TMZ. Big Shaq in big trouble? Talk show hosts speculated, some pretending to be neutral, others barely hiding their glee. We're not saying he did it, but let's be real. Why carry around that much cash in the first place? If this was anyone else, would we even be asking these questions? I mean, celebrities think they're untouchable. It wasn't about facts anymore. It was about narrative. Shaq sat in his penthouse, watching it unfold on the big screen. The muted television played a panel discussion. Experts debating his name like he was some abstract concept, not a man who could hear every word. His phone had been ringing non-stop. Sponsors, business partners, reporters. Everyone wanted a statement. Everyone wanted a piece. His lawyer, a sharp-witted woman named Jordan Hayes, paced across the room, phone glued to her ear, speaking in a low, clipped voice. They have no case, she said. No formal charges. They knew they had nothing, and they still pulled that stunt. Shaq leaned back, exhaling slowly. And now they got what they wanted. Jordan glanced at the screen. A news ticker scrolled across the bottom. O'Neal's arrest sparks debate. Is celebrity status a shield? They wanted to humiliate you, she muttered. And they did. Shaq clenched his jaw. He wasn't mad about the handcuffs, the accusations. He was mad because it worked. They'd planted doubt, not in him, not in his team, but in the public. And once that seed was planted, it never really went away. Somewhere across the city, a man sat in a dimly lit office, watching the same footage on a laptop. Detective Russell Haynes. A smirk tugged at his lips as he scrolled through the tweets, the comments, the arguments, the chaos. People were turning on Shaq. Good. This wasn't about the money. It never was. It was about control, power. He leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping against the desk. The first part of the plan had worked. Now, it was time for the next. His phone buzzed. A new message. A single line. It's done. She's gone. Haynes's smirk widened. Perfect. Shaq didn't realize something was wrong until late that night. His phone lit up with a text from Jordan. Jordan, call me. Now. He frowned and dialed. She picked up on the first ring. Shaq, she said, her voice tense, urgent. We have a problem. A pause. Then, the woman from the diner, the one you tipped. Shaq sat up straighter. Yeah? Jordan exhaled sharply. She's missing. The words sat heavy in the air. Shaq's mind moved fast, piecing it together. The cops. The fake money setup. Now this? Coincidence? No such thing. What do you mean missing? He asked, voice low. She hasn't been to work. No one's seen her since yesterday morning. Her phone's off. Her neighbors said she never came home. Shaq's grip tightened around his phone. This was too much. The cops arrested him for fake bills. Fine. They tried to humiliate him. Expected. But now? Now someone innocent was caught in the crossfire. His mind flashed back to the look on her face when he left the diner. The tears. The gratitude. And now? Gone. Silence stretched on the line before Jordan spoke again. I don't think this is random, she admitted. I think they're sending a message. Shaq's jaw locked. Then they sent it to the wrong person. The internet was still raging, debate still unfolding, but Shaq didn't care anymore. This wasn't about PR damage control now. This was something bigger. Bigger than a headline. Bigger than fake bills. Someone had just disappeared. And if they thought Shaq was going to just sit back and let it slide, they had no idea who they were dealing with. Shaq sat in his penthouse, the city lights stretching far beyond the glass walls, his mind racing. He had spent his entire career reading defenses, anticipating moves before they happened. But this wasn't a game. The waitress was gone. Not missing. Gone. No social media updates, no phone activity, no sightings. Just erased. And Shaq didn't believe in coincidences. His lawyer, Jordan Hayes, was already on it. And if there was one thing Jordan was good at, it was digging until she hit the truth. Tonight, she had found something. And it was worse than either of them had imagined. Jordan sat in her downtown office, files spread across her desk, her laptop glowing in the dim light. She had been on the phone for the past hour, speaking in low, clipped tones with contacts in law enforcement, ex-prosecutors, and an old friend in the FBI. The deeper she dug, the more the story unraveled. Finally, she picked up the phone and called Shaq. "You need to hear this," she said as soon as he answered. Shaq leaned forward, pressing the phone to his ear. "Talk to me." Jordan exhaled. This isn't about fake money. He already knew that. What is it then? She hesitated then. The officer who arrested you, Russell Haynes, he has a history, a long one. Shaq's fingers curled into a fist. How long? Jordan's voice was tight, controlled. 17 complaints, excessive force, unlawful searches. But the worst? A pause. He has a pattern, Shaq. A slow, creeping unease settled over him. What kind of pattern? Jordan flipped through her notes, her voice steady but urgent. Over the last 5 years, multiple black men in low-income neighborhoods have been arrested under suspicious circumstances, minor charges, traffic stops, petty theft. Shaq didn't move, his jaw tightening. Jordan continued. And then, they disappear. The words hung heavy in the air. Shaq's heartbeat slowed. Disappear? Jordan swallowed. They're released, charges dropped, no records, and within weeks, they're gone. No trace, no activity, just vanished. Shaq ran a hand over his face. This was bigger than him. Way bigger. And Haynes? He asked. Jordan clicked something on her laptop. He was involved in every single case. The weight of her words settled over him like a storm cloud. Shaq had always known corruption ran deep. But this was something else. He could handle being a target. But now, an innocent woman was gone. And she wasn't the first. Shaq exhaled through his nose, his voice calm but sharp. How deep does this go? Jordan's fingers flew over her keyboard. Deep. She pulled up a document, scanning the data. There's something else, something worse. Shaq waited. Haynes is tied to a counterfeit operation. Shaq sat up straighter. Jordan continued. There's been an underground ring pushing fake bills for the past 3 years. The FBI's been watching it, but they haven't been able to get close. Shaq didn't speak. He just listened. Jordan pressed on, her voice low. Every time they get a lead, it disappears. Witnesses retract statements. Evidence vanishes. Shaq knew where this was going. You think Haynes is covering for them? Jordan let out a slow breath. I think Haynes is one of them. The counterfeit bills, the waitress vanishing, his own arrest. It wasn't random, it was a warning. He had gotten too close. Shaq wasn't easily rattled. But this was personal now. He wasn't some kid on the street with no resources, no connections. They had messed with the wrong man. He stood, walking to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city he thought he knew. You think the feds know? He asked. Jordan hesitated. I think they suspect, but they don't have proof. Shaq was quiet for a long moment. Then finally he said, Then let's give it to them. By morning, the internet was still in chaos over Shaq's arrest. But behind the scenes, the FBI had just opened a new case file. And Shaq O'Neal? He wasn't just the suspect anymore. He was about to become their best lead. The morning after his release, Shaq woke up to a different world. His name was still trending. The news was still running his arrest footage on repeat. But now, the consequences were starting to hit where it hurt. His phone buzzed nonstop, but it wasn't the usual texts from friends, teammates, or business partners. These were corporate calls. Calls that started with, "We're reviewing the situation," and ended with, We need to pause our partnership until things clear up. Shaq sat in his home office, staring at a stack of legal documents, endorsement contracts, sponsorship deals, partnership agreements. All frozen. His team had already warned him. This wasn't about guilt. This was about image. Companies didn't like controversy. They didn't care about truth. They cared about risk. And right now, Shaq O'Neal was a liability. The news cycle had turned brutal. It wasn't just speculation anymore. It was mockery. Late-night talk show hosts took cheap shots, laughing at his expense. Maybe Shaq ain't so rich after all. Man out here using monopoly money. I mean, come on. You're a millionaire and you can't tell the difference between real cash and fake? Yikes. Pundits sat on news panels, nodding fake concern, pretending to be neutral. It's a shame, really. He had such a clean image. We're not saying he did it, but where there's smoke. The New York Times ran a column titled, "From MVP to Mugshot, the Fall of a Giant." They weren't even hiding it anymore. The city had turned its back. And the cops? They were celebrating. Inside a dimly lit bar, Detective Russell Haynes leaned against the counter, whiskey glass in hand, a satisfied smirk on his face. A few other officers sat with him, all laughing, toasting to their victory. "You see the headlines?" One of them chuckled, scrolling through Twitter. "Dude's getting cooked out there." Haynes took a slow sip of his drink. "Told you." He thought he could walk around throwing money like a damn king. Not anymore. Another officer shook his head. "Crazy thing is, we didn't even need to charge him. Just put the cuffs on, let the media do the rest." Haynes grinned. "And now?" "He's drowning. His deals are drying up. Give it a few months and he'll be begging for a way out." They all laughed. Because to them, this was over. They had won. But what they didn't know? Shaq had people in high places, and he wasn't done yet. That night, Shaq sat in his penthouse, watching the city glow beneath him. His world was crumbling in real time, but his mind? Sharper than ever. He pulled out his phone and made a single call. The voice on the other end answered immediately. "I was waiting for you to call." Shaq's eyes didn't leave the skyline. "You saw what they did." A pause. Then, "I did. And I assume you're ready to move?" Shaq exhaled slowly. "Yeah, I'm ready." The voice on the other end chuckled, low and knowing. "Then let's remind them who they're dealing with." And just like that, the game changed. Shaq sat in his penthouse, the dim glow of his laptop screen illuminating his face. His mind was focused, sharper than it had been in years. He wasn't thinking about basketball, money, or endorsements. He was thinking about her, the woman from the diner, the woman who had taken his tip, smiled through her exhaustion, and now vanished. Until tonight. Tonight, Jordan had called him, and what she told him changed everything. "She's alive." The words hung between them, sharp and cutting. Shaq sat up, gripping the phone tighter. Jordan's voice was urgent, breathless. A hospital in Boyle Heights just admitted a woman with bruises all over her body. No ID, no records. She wouldn't give her name. But when one of my people went to check, Shaq could already see where this was going. "It's her," Jordan finished. Shaq closed his eyes. Relief, anger, frustration, all at once. "Where is she now?" he asked. "She's still there," Jordan said. "But Shaq," she hesitated. "She's not talking." Shaq's jaw clenched. "She's scared?" Jordan exhaled. "More than scared." Silence. Then Jordan's voice, quieter now. "I think someone got to her first." 15 minutes later, Shaq was on the road. The city blurred past as his driver maneuvered through late-night traffic, heading straight to St. Mary's Hospital. Shaq didn't speak. He didn't need to. His mind was locked on one thing. Whoever did this, they were going to regret it. The hospital room was dimly lit, the air filled with the sterile scent of antiseptic and something softer. Fear. She sat on the bed, small, fragile, haunted. Bruises bloomed across her arms, her cheek swollen, a cut above her eyebrow still fresh. The IV in her arm dripped steadily, a machine beeping softly beside her. When she saw Shaq step into the room, her eyes widened. Not in fear, but in something close to disbelief, like she hadn't expected him to come. like she had already given up. Jordan was at her bedside, speaking softly. When she saw Shaq, she straightened. "She hasn't said much," Jordan murmured. "But she needs to." Shaq nodded and stepped forward. The woman, her name was Rebecca, Jordan had told him, watched him, her hands gripping the thin hospital blanket like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Shaq pulled up a chair, lowering himself down until he was eye level with her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Shaq said, "I need to know what happened." Rebecca flinched at the words. Her gaze darted to the door, to the shadows in the corners of the room, like she expected someone to be watching. I can't," she whispered. Shaq's voice remained steady, but there was an edge to it now. "Yes, you can." She shook her head rapidly, panic rising in her throat. "No, I can't. They said—" She stopped herself, eyes squeezing shut. Shaq leaned in, his voice lower now. "Who?" She didn't answer. Shaq didn't push. Instead, he spoke calmly, patiently. "You don't have to be afraid of them anymore." Rebecca let out a shaky breath. Then slowly she whispered, "They told me to say the money was fake. Or else." Silence. Shaq felt his stomach drop. It was exactly what he thought. They hadn't just tried to frame him. They were using her to do it. Jordan stepped forward. "Who are they?" she asked. Rebecca swallowed hard. "The cops. At least, I think they were cops. They took me after my shift, shoved me into a car, told me if anyone asked, I had to say the money Shaq gave me was fake, that it came from him." Shaq's jaw tightened. "And if you didn't?" Her hands trembled. "They said I'd disappear, like the others." Like the others. Shaq and Jordan exchanged a glance. It confirmed everything. The missing men, the silence, the pattern. Rebecca wasn't supposed to make it out. She was supposed to become another statistic. Instead, she survived. And now, they had proof. Shaq stood up. "This is over." Jordan's brows furrowed. "Shaq." "No," Shaq cut her off. "This is over. They think they run this city? They think they can make people disappear? They don't know who they're messing with." Rebecca shrank back slightly, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "What are you going to do?" Shaq met her gaze, and when he spoke, it wasn't anger. It was certainty. "I'm going to make sure they never do this to anyone else again." Shaq didn't fight with fists. That was what they expected. What they didn't expect? He fought with power, with influence, with strategy, with money. That night, Shaq didn't call reporters. He didn't blast the story on Twitter. He called people who actually mattered. By sunrise, his network was moving. Jordan reached out to her FBI contacts. Shaq's billionaire friends started pulling city records, and a name surfaced. Detective Russell Haynes, the man who arrested Shaq, the man whose name was attached to every single missing person case. And now, they had him. Russell Haynes didn't know it yet, but in the next 48 hours, his world was going to fall apart. The war didn't start with sirens. It didn't start with gunfire or flashing lights. It started with a single phone call. Shaq sat in his penthouse, the city sprawled beneath him, his phone pressed to his ear. His voice was calm, steady, but every word carried weight. "They tried to ruin me," he said, speaking to a man who didn't need an introduction. "Now, I'm going to ruin them." The voice on the other end chuckled, low and knowing. "Tell me what you need." Shaq didn't hesitate. "I need this city to remember who I am." Within hours, the machine was moving. Shaq wasn't just an athlete. He wasn't just a celebrity. He was a brand, a businessman, a powerhouse. And he had friends in high places. Calls were made, conversations were had. And by morning, the story had flipped. It started with a leak. A well-placed journalist, one of Shaq's longtime allies, broke the news. Exclusive. Officers involved in Shaq's arrest tied to years of corruption. Then came another. Breaking. Detective Russell Haynes linked to multiple missing persons cases. And then, the floodgates opened. Newscasters scrambled to keep up with the bombshells dropping every hour. CNN. Shaquille O'Neal was a target, but why? MSNBC. A pattern of abuse. LAPD under fire after new evidence emerges. The Washington Post. Exposing the network. How a group of officers covered up their own crimes. And just like that, the city turned on the cops. Inside the LAPD headquarters, chaos erupted. The police chief's office was in a meltdown. Chief Bennett paced the room, his face red, his phone vibrating nonstop. "This is bad," one of his advisors muttered. "Really bad." Bennett shot him a glare. "I can see that." Another aide rushed in, pale-faced, holding a tablet. "Sir, there's more." Bennett snatched it, his expression tightening as he read the latest update. Russell Haynes. His name was everywhere. The reports detailed his past complaints, his connections to missing persons, his involvement in the counterfeit ring. And worst of all, it was only getting bigger. Haynes himself was watching from his car, the glow of his phone screen illuminating the sweat on his forehead. He scrolled through the headlines, his fingers gripping the wheel tighter with every word. This wasn't supposed to happen. Shaq was supposed to go down quietly. This was supposed to be a warning, a humiliation. Instead, the entire department was about to burn. His phone rang. A blocked number. He hesitated, then answered. "Yeah?" A pause, then a voice. "Run." The line went dead. By mid-afternoon, the FBI arrived. Black SUVs pulled up outside the LAPD station, agents stepping out, their expressions grim and focused. Inside, officers scrambled. Some deleted emails. Some made desperate calls. But it was too late. Federal agents stormed the building, warrants in hand. Desks were searched. Files were seized. And then they came for the cops. Shaq sat in his penthouse, watching the live footage on his TV. It was poetic. The same officers who had humiliated him, who had thrown him in cuffs, were now being dragged out in handcuffs themselves. Detective Haynes was the last to go. His face was pale, his jaw clenched, but his eyes. They found Shaq through the screen. And in that moment, he knew. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't luck. Shaq had done this. And Haynes? He would never forget it. Shaq turned off the TV, his phone buzzing with messages. But he didn't need to answer them. He had already won. The war was over. The city moved fast when it needed to. One day, Shaq was the headline of every scandal, his name dragged through the mud by reporters who couldn't resist the spectacle of a fallen giant. The next, the same media that mocked him, that laughed at his expense, that questioned his integrity, were now scrambling to fix their mistakes. Because the truth was out. And now, the city was begging for forgiveness. It started with the news stations. Just days ago, their headlines screamed, "Shaquille O'Neal arrested, fake money scandal," with panels of so-called experts debating whether his downfall was self-inflicted or inevitable. Now they were scrambling to rewrite the narrative. CNN. Shaq's arrest was a setup. How a corrupt system targeted an innocent man. Fox News. Police chief resigns as FBI uncovers massive scandal. MSNBC. The real story. How Shaquille O'Neal brought down a rotten police network. Shaq watched the reports roll in, his phone buzzing with apologies disguised as interview requests. Every anchor that had once raised doubts about him now wanted his side of the story. "Mr. O'Neal, we'd love to have you on to clear the air." "Shaq, our audience would love to hear directly from you. What was going through your mind during all this? We recognize now that the initial coverage may have been unfair." Shaq almost laughed at that last one. Unfair? Unfair was what they did to him. Unfair was how they ran with rumors over facts. Unfair was how they watched a man with a spotless reputation get arrested like a common criminal. And instead of questioning the system, they questioned him. And now they wanted to fix it. Now they wanted him to speak. But Shaq wasn't interested in helping them clean up their mess. Then came the mayor's call. Jordan was the one who saw it first. She walked into Shaq's home office, phone in hand, shaking her head. "You're gonna love this," she said, placing the phone on his desk. Shaq raised a brow and looked at the screen. Mayor calling. He let it ring. Jordan smirked. "You're not gonna answer?" Shaq leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. Let him sweat. Jordan chuckled. Cold. Accurate, Shaq corrected. Because when he needed the city to have his back, where was the mayor? Where was the statement of support? Where was the outrage when a man who spent his life giving back was thrown into the back of a police car like some low-level crook? Now that the truth was out, now that people were getting fired, arrested, exposed, now the mayor wanted to talk. Shaq let the phone go to voicemail. He had nothing to say to him. The people who betrayed him weren't just the cops. It was the reporters, the public figures, the brands who claimed to stand for justice, but were too afraid to back him when it mattered. Shaq scrolled through his emails, watching as statements flooded in. Nike. We stand with Shaquille O'Neal and deeply regret any premature actions taken. Gatorade. As a longtime partner of Shaq, we support him fully and look forward to continuing our relationship. American Express. We are grateful for Mr. O'Neal's contributions to our brand and are happy to reaffirm our partnership. Happy to reaffirm? They dropped him the second things got tough. And now? Now they were proud to stand with him. Shaq shook his head. They thought he would just forget. They thought they could play both sides, distance themselves when he was down, and celebrate him when he rose again. They thought wrong. Jordan sat across from him, watching as he ignored call after call, request after request. You're really not going to give a statement? She asked. Shaq exhaled, rubbing his chin. Nah. Jordan raised a brow. You sure? This is your moment. You could go on TV right now and say whatever you want. Shaq looked at her, expression unreadable. Then he smirked. I already said everything I needed to. Jordan frowned. When? Shaq pulled out his phone, scrolled for a second, then turned the screen toward her. A single tweet. A single line. Y'all tried to play me. Look where that got you. Jordan read it, then burst out laughing. Oh, that's cold. Shaq grinned. Accurate. Jordan shook her head. You know this is going to break the internet, right? Shaq leaned back, completely relaxed for the first time in days. Good. Because the people who turned on him, they weren't getting a press conference. They weren't getting a long speech. They were getting one sentence. And they were going to have to live with it. The night was supposed to be a celebration. The charity event had been planned weeks ago, long before the scandal, long before the arrest, long before Shaq found himself in the middle of something so much bigger than just a bad headline. Yet somehow, it had taken on a different energy now. Now, it wasn't just an event. It was a statement. A room full of celebrities, politicians, and executives, all gathered under a single roof to applaud Shaq for his resilience, his generosity, his ability to rise above. People shook his hand, clapped him on the back, posed for photos. They smiled wide, laughed loud, acted like they had never doubted him. Shaq played along, nodding, smiling, but he wasn't fooled. The same people who were praising him tonight had been silent when it mattered. And now? Now, they wanted to be on the right side of history. Shaq let them have their moment, because while they celebrated, he knew something they didn't. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The evening was winding down when Shaq stepped outside, the cool night air a relief from the heat of the crowded ballroom. Photographers were still hanging around, hoping for one last shot. A few reporters called his name, but he ignored them, moving toward his car, security trailing behind at a respectful distance. His driver opened the door for him, but before he could step inside, he felt something. A small shift in his jacket pocket. Subtle, almost unnoticeable. His instincts kicked in instantly. Shaq reached inside, fingers brushing against a folded piece of paper. No, not just paper. Money. A crisp $100 bill. And he knew before he even looked what he was about to see. He unfolded it slowly, carefully. It was identical to the ones that had been used to frame him. But this time, there was something different. Written across the bill in black ink were 3 words. You're still next. Shaq's mind sharpened in an instant. This wasn't some coincidence. This wasn't some random reminder of the past. This was a message. And the worst part, whoever left it had been close enough to touch him. His eyes flicked up, scanning the street, the sidewalks, the sea of people. But there was nothing. No one out of place. No one lingering too long. Whoever had done this was already gone. Back inside the car, Shaq sat in silence, staring at the bill in his hands. His driver glanced at him through the mirror. "Everything all right, sir?" Shaq didn't answer right away. He just turned the bill over, examining it. It was perfect. Same paper, same texture, same forgery. The counterfeit ring hadn't been shut down. The cops had been arrested, yes, their network exposed. But the real people behind it, the ones pulling the strings, still out there, watching, waiting. By the time Shaq got home, Jordan was already on the phone with him. "You don't sound surprised," she said when he told her about the bill. Shaq exhaled, running a hand over his face. "I'm not." Jordan sighed. "I was hoping this was over." Shaq glanced down at the bill one more time. So were they. A beat of silence. Then Jordan asked the question they were both thinking. "What do we do now?" Shaq's response was immediate. "We finish it." But the problem with finishing it was simple. He didn't know who he was fighting yet. The cops were gone. The police chief resigned. The mayor was still trying to clean up his image. So who was left? Who was powerful enough to still be in the shadows, still watching, still sending threats? Who had something to lose if Shaq kept digging? The next morning, Shaq made a call. Not to Jordan, not to his usual people, to someone he never thought he'd need. A man who knew how crime worked in this city. A man who had made a fortune off knowing what the police never did. His name was Vince Carter. And before Shaq had turned his life into something clean, something respectable, Vince had been the kind of man who lived in the gray. Vince took the meeting. They sat in a private lounge, the city moving around them. Vince, sharp-eyed and always one step ahead, leaned back in his seat, swirling a glass of whiskey. "You're not a man who likes asking for help," Vince observed. Shaq slid the bill across the table. Vince glanced at it, then let out a low whistle. "Damn." "You recognize it?" Shaq asked. Vince's smirk was humorless. "Recognize it?" "Shaq, I know exactly who made it." Silence. Vince leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "But you're not going to like the answer." Shaq met his gaze, unflinching. "Tell me." Vince exhaled slowly, placing the bill down like it carried weight beyond its physical form. "You ever heard the name Dante Reeves?" Shaq's stomach tightened, because he had, and if Vince was right, this was way bigger than dirty cops. This was about organized crime. And Shaq just became their biggest problem. The game wasn't over, not by a long shot. The city thought it had seen the final chapter, that Shaq's arrest, the downfall of the corrupt cops, and the FBI raids were the end of the story. They were wrong, because the real enemy was still out there. Shaq had spent his whole life playing the long game, on the court, in business, and now in a battle he never asked for but refused to lose. They had underestimated him. They had played their hand, thinking he'd fold. But now, it was his turn. The phone call was made at midnight. Not to Jordan, not to Vince, to someone bigger. A man who didn't live in the public eye, didn't take interviews, didn't make headlines, but controlled people who did. His name was Samuel Greer. Old money, old power. The kind that didn't move loudly, but could move entire cities. The kind that could make problems disappear. Shaq had done Greer a favor once. A quiet one. One that never made the papers. And in their world, favors were currency. Greer picked up on the first ring. "I was wondering when you'd call," the voice drawled, smooth and slow, like a man who was never in a hurry. Shaq didn't waste time. "You still owe me," he said, a chuckle. "That I do." Shaq leaned back, staring at the city skyline through his penthouse window. "I'm cashing in." A pause. Then, Greer's voice, cool and certain. "Tell me what you need." The next 48 hours changed everything. One by one, the remaining dirty cops started disappearing. Not in a way that made headlines, not in body bags or dramatic arrests. They resigned. Some retired early, citing personal reasons. Some transferred quietly out of state, their records sealed, their past erased. Some, they just vanished. No media coverage. No explanation. They were just gone. And the ones who remained? They got the message. Whatever was left of the old network, the ones who still thought they could operate in the shadows, who thought they could get rid of people like Rebecca, who thought they could send warnings to Shaq. They learned that the game had changed, and Shaquille O'Neal was now the one in control. The FBI was still investigating, but Shaq already knew how this would end. The real power didn't move through law enforcement. It moved through money, influence, control, and Shaq? He now owned the city. The mayor called again. Shaq let it go to voicemail. Jordan smirked when she saw it. Still making him sweat? Shaq didn't answer. He just leaned back in his chair, watching the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He had spent years giving to this city, building schools, funding programs, helping the same people who had turned their backs on him the second things got tough. But now, they would never forget his name again. Because Shaq didn't just win. He rewrote the game. And for those who tried to play him, he didn't forgive. He didn't forget. They tried to take him down. They failed. But this isn't just Shaq's story. It's bigger than one man. Corruption runs deep. Power moves in silence. And the game? It's never really over. Stay sharp. Stay watching. Because the next move, it's already happening.